Hello, disciples. Welcome to this week's edition of Imagine with Me, where I have the extreme honor and privilege to talk with so many leaders and servant leaders across our whole church. Today's guest is the Reverend Caroline Hamilton-Arnold, who works with Week of Compassion. We're grateful for her time with us today. Many of you may know about the Week of Compassion ministry and what it does and how it represents us as the Christian Church disciples of Christ in so many ways. But I'm going to allow Caroline to say a little bit about herself and Week of Compassion and her role in that ministry. So thank you so much for making time for us today, Caroline.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terri. It's wonderful to be with you and to have this moment to imagine together. I love the concept of this series and think that's such a wonderful way for us to interact as disciples and think about how we can think toward the future and where God is calling us to be together. I have the privilege of serving as Associate Director for Domestic Disaster Response with Week of Compassion, the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund for the Disciples. Broadly, we work with partners to alleviate suffering around the world through the faithfulness of disciples across 7.5 decades. We have been helping to connect disciple resources, human, informational, relational, financial, from disciples to places of crisis and need around the world. So sometimes those crises are extreme poverty that our siblings and neighbors around the world face. Sometimes it's the crisis of displacement from war and persecution. And sometimes it's the crisis of disaster, human caused, or more frequently, our natural and climate caused disasters. And my role specifically is within our domestic disaster response. So for disciples, that's the US and Canada, and helping to respond when disciples have been directly affected, providing solidarity grants and assistance to disciples who have had damage to their church buildings or their homes or their communities because of disasters, and then helping to connect disciples to serve, to bring to bear our resources to help communities recover.
I had, when I was only, perhaps had been only in the ministry of General Minister and President for a couple of months, in the fall of 2017, I spent time with you, and Andy Mangum had just become regional minister of the Southwest, and I got to see firsthand the impact of Week of Compassion and your relationship building, Caroline, on the ground as we were traveling through areas in Texas that had been hit by Hurricane Harvey. And I'm extremely grateful for the relational nature of what Week of Compassion does. You weren't a stranger to the people in Texas. And as we have seen other disasters and other issues where we need to respond, one of the things I think disciples should be really proud of is that we're on the ground in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. COVID-19 has sort of thrown us for many loops. We've talked about the multiple pandemics that have been in place. Could you talk to us a little bit about how Week of Compassion has responded to this pandemic, and how you've approached it in terms of providing support and care and response?
Sure, yeah. It was such an honor to have you with us, and I know that meant a lot to the pastors that we met with and the communities we met with across Southeast Texas. We have in our mission statement that we work with partners. It's a theological commitment for us, that as disciples, part of this commitment to unity and commitment to ecumenism is working with partners, and an acknowledgement of the ways God is already present and moving in local communities. We don't bring the hope of God, or we don't bring God's love. We discover it there, and we carry it with us as well through the gifts that we bring and the resources we bring. But that working through partners is fundamental to how we exist and how we provide assistance. That has become all the more important through COVID-19. This pandemic has affected every area of our work. Every one of our partners has had to adapt, and has had to find new ways of working alongside and for the communities they are serving. There have been new needs that have come up because of the pandemic. Globally and domestically, we have seen just incredible struggles for basic needs, with the limitations to travel for migrant workers in India and in Southeast Asia, where we have partners very active. It was often just trying to provide sort of basic necessities, cash assistance, food, assistance to families. Here in the US and Canada, it was a lot of support to disciples' congregations, either when they had members with extreme financial distress, or supporting their food ministries to support their neighbors. And we have seen all of our partners adapting to try and continue their ongoing work. That we still have folks recovering from Hurricane Harvey from 2017, and Hurricane Florence and Michael in 2018, and wildfires from several years, and all kinds of other disasters. And as the flow of volunteers has had to slow down, our partners have had to adapt their responses as well. And we saw the ways that we could bring to bear some of the wisdom of disaster response ministry in this new ongoing, who thought a year ago we would still be in this moment, but that we could bring some of the wisdom from disaster response, some of the ways of partnering and ways of addressing crisis in communities. So pretty early on, we made that decision to try and approach this in that way. So making available some solidarity grants for our congregations to support their families and ministries, and then finding ways to partner across the disciples' ministries. And you had pulled together that general ministries task force, folks who had sort of direct ties in their ministry to needs that were arising from COVID-19. And I remember some of those early calls, it was a lot of just sharing what we were seeing out in the church and what we were hearing from folks. And so many times we ended up talking about the trauma that people were experiencing because of this pandemic, both the trauma for those who were in the thick of it at the time and were having losses and grief, but then also just the disruption, the sense of unknowing, the anxiety that comes from having your whole world change so rapidly.
Right.
And we talked about how we could support clergy themselves as they went through this trauma, and how we could support clergy to serve their congregations who were going through this. And so we called together a working group that had folks from NBA and Pension Fund and the College of Regional Ministers and Week of Compassion to say, what resources do we have? How can we provide assistance? And that was such a fruitful conversation. And there has been now for a couple of months a resource site on disciples.org through the COVID-19 page for trauma care resources, both acknowledging that we're going through this, naming it, and starting to understand some of the ways that we can care for ourselves and each other in the midst of the disruption.
Yeah. And that work that you mentioned, I've spoken of it in other contexts, but really I'm so proud of the work that the general ministries in particular, as well as the regional ministries, have done across the church to respond to so many needs. You mentioned the Clergy Trauma Resources Project, and I think one of the ways in which the church has learned a lot has been about just the whole issue of the impact of trauma, the need for mental health resources, and to care for all of us, both clergy as well as the entire population of our church, but particularly clergy. So I'm really excited about the set of resources that working group pulled together. Could you talk a little bit about other collaborations that came out of that task force? I know that Week of Compassion and other groups work together in terms of coordinating grants and other kinds of support. Could you talk a little bit about some of the other collaboration that has come out of that group?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just information sharing, which has been great. Just knowing this is what we're hearing from this area, and being able to share with some of the financial ministries and have their information coming through. All the general ministries has been really helpful. We worked very closely with Week of Compassion and NBA, as they had some COVID specific grant funding, and then adapted some of their ongoing ministry grants so that we could refer to one another. We kind of carved out our niches, and there were a few areas where there was overlap, but where we could say, okay, this is a ministry that really is focused on ministry with children and serving needs of children as they're going to virtual learning. That's a good fit for NBA, and referring folks over that way. And NBA sending folks over our way when it was a feeding ministry, or folks who needed direct assistance to households, which didn't fit within the criteria that NBA had set up. And then just helping to direct people to the right place so they could access resources that they needed and that were available.
As we're talking about this whole notion of imagining, right? Imagining a new church for a new world, and even more importantly, how we show up as church in that world. How do you see Week of Compassion? As you say, you don't, I love the fact that you said we don't bring, we discover where God is, right, in the moment, and people are already on the ground wherever you're partnering, and you're not just there alone. You're there to amplify perhaps and support the work that good people are already doing. How might you see Week of Compassion participating as you see the needs of congregations shifting for what we need to look like in this new world? We use this language of imagining God's limitless love, and for me, that's where it all begins, right? That we're called to live that love out. So imagine with me a bit about what Week of Compassion might be doing or look like, or how you think we need to grow with this ministry, one of the most recognizable ministries of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. How might we see you moving forward in the future?
Small question.
Small question. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think it was Brian Frederick Gray who said last week that imagining is fundamental to the work of justice. And I think imagination is fundamental to the work that Week of Compassion does as well. That in everything we're doing, we're imagining how could we have greater flourishing of life? How can we be partnering with God in bringing forth the future that God is already imagining? And that looks like sustainable communities. It looks like people partnering in ways that we don't see when we're not in crisis. I think I especially with the domestic disaster work, get a particular view of how communities can transform, because you have to imagine a new way. You can't just go back to the way things were once you've had a major disaster. And so we're always doing the work of imagining what a better future could be like as we rebuild in a community. We are internally doing some reimagining of, as we're coming out of a pandemic when we've had to suspend all of our volunteer activities for disaster rebuilding and recovery. What are some new ways that disciples can engage with local communities? How can we prioritize our disaster recovery funding and presence to really create sustainable change for communities? We're in partnership with a community in Ohio in the Dayton area, where it's all about increasing access to affordable housing and pathways to home ownership coming out of tornado recovery. So folks who were displaced by a tornado, being able to move back into their community, place where they feel rooted and connected, but in ways that are more sustainable, more economically viable, more fruitful for the whole community, and really thinking about community resilience. We're also looking at disaster preparedness as part of that work too. That I have big dreams. If we're going to imagine, Terri, let's go.
Let's go.
Of all of our disciple congregations being fully prepared, having their plan of how do we care for our immediate community, our church members, make sure everybody's taken care of. I'm in Houston today. We're recording this on Monday, and it's 22 degrees, which is ridiculous in Houston.
Yeah.
And we're having rolling blackouts and some prolonged power outages across the city. And I keep thinking about how are we caring for our elderly neighbors, our folks who have access and functional needs and really need power today to be safe and well. And are our churches thinking about that? Are our churches positioned to connect with community organizations and be engaged in rebuilding their communities after an event? And we're continually in these conversations with our international partners as well, thinking about what will resilient communities look like coming out of this pandemic. What are the priorities that we need to focus on? And it's a live conversation, but I think there's some really interesting potential for disciples to be part of something important.
That's awesome. I love that you've lifted up the fact that we can't go back, just as communities who've experienced other kinds of disasters understand. Because of COVID, we can't go back in a lot of ways, and being prepared and the idea of resilience is always just the ability to imagine, if I have to turn the corner, what does that look like, and to name what it looks like, and even what it feels like to be a church that's prepared, a church that's resilient. We know that in the next couple of weeks, the Week of Compassion offering will be taken up in all of our churches. And I just want to give a shout out to this ministry. I'm always tweeting, when Week of Compassion is there, the whole church is there. And so I invite all of our congregations to be generous in their support of this important ministry. And I hope that you've heard from this conversation how collaborative all of our general ministries have been during this time. So your contributions not only to Week of Compassion, but even to Disciples Mission Fund, help ensure that all of these ministries are able to work together to meet the needs of our church now like never before. So Caroline, thank you so much for your time with me today. We also want to give a shout out to Reverend V. Nguyen, the Executive Director of Week of Compassion. I thank you for always keeping me in the loop. When disasters are happening, you always enable me to be able to reach out in a personal way to people who've been impacted, particularly the clergy. So thank you for your partnership, for the covenant relationship that you model as part of our whole church. And we just thank God for Week of Compassion. And again, we hope that our congregations will support you like never before this year for the Week of Compassion offering. Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thanks, Terri.
And disciples, stay tuned for more conversations. Continue to imagine with me, will you? What we must be as a new church responding to God's call to show God's limitless love in this new world. Take care and remember that God loves you, and so do I.